In this episode of Oh My Menses, we are talking all about tracking your menstrual cycle. Yes, it's more than just tracking your period. I have a lot to say about it. This is perfect for you if you want to up-level your current cycle tracking game, or if you're returning to cycle tracking after maybe being on hormonal birth control, or just taking a break for a while. I'm so excited to share everything I have to say about this topic with you. This episode does go hand in hand with one of my current resources that I have available for download. It's free. It's my holistic cycle tracking guide. It's going to break down everything that I talk about here, and you will get some juicy email support when you download that as well. Let's get tracking. Cycle Tracking 101, let's get into it. And I want to start with the why. No. I want to start with a cycle check-in, which I'm able to do because I track my cycle. I actually track and chart my cycle. They are two different things, and I will save that detail for another episode. I am pulling up my Read Your Body app now. I am on cycle day 24, and it was probably a few days ago that I felt the drop into my luteal phase, the second half of my cycle, and I have been feeling the pull down. I've been feeling the pull down back into my body after an ovulatory high. I have been seeing my cervical fluid dry up and become less fertile. And I am being called to come inward. I'm feeling my social meter go down in terms of how much socializing I can handle, how much extroversion I can handle. But I'm feeling good. I'm feeling clarity and focus, which is so delicious for the luteal phase. That is my cycle check-in. If you haven't checked in with your own cycle today, I highly invite you to. It's just a fun thing to do, to connect with your body, see what your cycle's doing. And speaking of, today is going to be all about what your cycle's doing and how we can track that. So, back to the why of why do we want to track our menstrual cycles? What do we get out of it? What is the point? And one of my favorite reasons for tracking the menstrual cycle is because you can start to match your experience, your symptoms, your feelings, your vibe with your cycle phases. And I love this because there's still, even though I am so in the world of menstrual cycle awareness, and sometimes I begin to think that everyone knows about this and there's no point in me talking about it, I am deliciously reminded pretty frequently that it isn't common knowledge that there is more to the menstrual cycle than the period, and that we do have these phases. And when we tap into these phases, we have access to these beautiful cyclical superpowers, these beautiful prompts from nature reminding us of how to live in line with her and how to slow down and when to put our foot on the accelerator, when to take our foot off the brake, when to pump the brakes. These beautiful prompts from nature. So I love that cycle phase connection. I love seeing people, and for myself, becoming in tune with the shifts. So I start to be aware of when I am going into a phase, coming out of a phase, when that transitionatory moment is. And then with that, you can apply cyclical living. You can understand what each phase represents, what is good to do in each phase, what your body needs more or less of in each phase. And that also paves the path for just self-acceptance. When you understand what is normal for a specific menstrual cycle phase, you've got that explanation of like, this is why my body is doing this thing. When you don't feel like the same person every day of the month, you have that permission slip of, I'm a cyclical being. This is why I don't feel the same every day, and that's okay. And when we step into that energy of acceptance, I feel like that's when things can really progress and really flow smoothly when it comes to healing. So that's my thought there. I also love tracking menstrual cycles in the way that I do so that I can start to predict my periods more accurately. So there's a few layers to that. And the thing I will say here, and we are going to bust a few myths because it wouldn't be Karinda talking to herself. No, I'm talking to you guys. But it wouldn't be Karinda talking for like 30 minutes to an hour if there wasn't at least one myth bust in here. And the myth I want to bust there is that the predictions that your menstrual cycle tracking app, your period tracking app conveys to you, communicates with you, the predictions are not reliable or accurate. I guess I shouldn't say they're not accurate because, your app can say you're going to get your period on this day, and you can get your period on that day. But the reason why I encourage all my clients and myself to not rely on those predictions and to turn them off if it's possible on your app is because an app doesn't know when you ovulate. And here's another little myth bust here. If you didn't know, your period, when your period's estimated time of arrival is dependent on when you ovulate. Your period will always arrive 12 to 16 days after ovulation. Please note that there are times when you can bleed and it's not a quote unquote true period, and ovulation hasn't occurred 12 to 16 days beforehand. But for now, we're gonna stick with run of the mill periods because there's too much nuance to cover. And this leads into my another point. Another reason why I love cycle tracking is because you begin to understand your fertility. You begin to understand your fertile window. And again, there's so much more to cycle tracking than just marking your period in a calendar. When you start to connect with these phases and you understand how your body changes and what changes in general as you move through each phase, you start to become aware of your fertility and your fertile potential. That opens a whole realm of options when it comes to conscious contraception and natural birth control. And also supporting conception if pregnancy is your goal. Again, that's a story for another day. And next week, I will be talking all about why ovulation is important beyond fertility. So much more coming. And a quick aside, if you don't know what ovulation is, that is a single event that happens in your cycle that determines your fertility. That is to say, you can only fall pregnant within a certain window of ovulation. And you can certainly not fall pregnant at any given time of your cycle. It has to be close to ovulation. If you'd love to learn more about ovulation, given that it is the main event of your menstrual cycle, I do have an All About Ovulation masterclass that you can access instantly for $22, downloadable on my website, links in the show notes. So other reasons that I love cycle tracking, just to riff through a few more, see what resonates with you. And I think this is important to establish now because your why and your motivation for doing something informs so much about the consistency that you'll have with it and your motivation to stay on top of it and to keep doing it. And I really think it's important that everyone who menstruates tracks their cycle. There are just so many benefits. So I'll riff a few more. I love how it helps people develop a strong sense of body literacy, understanding what their body is doing, why their body is doing it, and a general sense of how their body works. Having a clear idea of when your period is on her way. Love that. You can pinpoint any premenstrual symptoms in order to optimize their management. So this is great for people with PMS or PMDD. When you start to track your symptoms in line with your cycle, it makes it so much easier to time or tailor certain treatments to those times. And it also gives us an idea of what hormones could be at play, what hormones could be fueling those symptoms depending on what time of your cycle it happened in. As I mentioned, knowing when you're fertile, such a good pro. Understanding how your hormones relate to your different cycle phases, again, based on symptoms. You get to make life adjustments to live in true alignment with your body and your inner rhythm. Love coming back to that. And you get to learn the signals and cues from your body that indicate that there's an imbalance, that something's off, or that there's room for extra support. So again, I just love that with cycle tracking, regardless of how you do it, you bring that awareness to your body. So even if you don't do it the most thoroughly, you're saying yes to your body. You're saying, yes, I am listening, I am paying attention. And there is so much potent potential there as soon as we start doing that, as simple as it is. Do I have any other benefits? No, I think we've covered them. Do I have any other myths that I want to shout out? So yeah, tracking your cycle goes beyond tracking your period on a calendar. App predictions when they relate to your period or ovulation are not reliable, and I do not recommend relying on them. And there's more to your cycle than your period. Being aware of your whole cycle can tell you so much more about your body than just your period can, although your period is also a really important sign. Don't want to dismiss the period. Shout out Menses. So this is for if you are tracking your cycle for the first time. This is for if you are tracking your cycle after taking a break for a while. Maybe you used to track it in the past. Maybe you've only been tracking it in a calendar, just marking the days that you bleed and you want to take it up a notch. Maybe you've come off hormonal birth control and you're like, all right, my cycle's going to resume soon. I want to start tracking it well from the outset. And just anyone who already tracks their cycle and you want to know more about it. You want to know how you can make it better. And if you're wanting to invite this holistic aspect into your current cycle tracking routine. So, how to track your cycle. First things first. There's going to be 3 major things that I go through. Tracking your period, tracking your cervical mucus, and tracking your premenstrual symptoms, as well as all of your symptoms. So, yeah, it sounds really obvious. Track your period. But there's, even just in that simplicity, there is nuance. When does our cycle start? What day do we mark as the first day of our cycle? So, cycle day 1 is the first day of full flow bleeding. And some people might go, yeah, duh. Start of your cycle is when your period arrives. Cool. But if you're someone who experiences a lot of spotting or, quite like spotty bleeding or very, very light bleeding before your period, maybe for a few days before your period, it can be confusing to know what day do I tell my app that my period started? When do I say my cycle started? So if you do get spotting beforehand, that is not technically considered the start of your cycle. You're going to want to mark cycle day 1 as the first day of full flow bleeding. And I also encourage people to track other symptoms related to their period. I invite you to track what your period is telling you. Is there pain that arrives with your period? What is the color of your menstrual blood? That can tell you so much just on its own. And shout out to any TCM practitioners listening. I feel like there's just a wealth of knowledge that you can ascertain, that a Chinese medicine practitioner can ascertain from the color of the blood alone. Do you get any clots? How big are they? What shape are they? What color are they? How frequent are they? And of course, heaviness, tracking the flow. How heavy is your period on each day? And this is where I love to be able to take custom notes, depending on how you track your cycle, which I'll shout out my preferred methods at the end. And it can be hard to objectively measure how heavy your period is. Like, what is a heavy period? And I think they actually just recently updated the definition of heavy menstrual bleeding, actually. Yeah, it used to be like over more than 80 milliliters of menstrual blood over the course of the menstruation. And I think they've now just changed it to any amount of bleeding that, and this, I'm not reading off anything, so this isn't going to be exactly right. Any amount of bleeding that like essentially interferes with your day-to-day functioning or causes you discomfort. Yeah, I want to review that now actually, but it really interesting. They took away the number amount because first point here, who was measuring their menstrual blood in milliliters. You know, how unless you use a menstrual cup, and even if you do, people aren't tracking the mill, you know. So I really love that they changed the definition of heavy menstrual bleeding to just encompass like the functionality and the experience behind it. Because imagine someone who was experiencing heavy bleeding, what they felt like was heavy, uncomfortable to wear certain clothes, interfered with their social life, couldn't go out on certain days of their period because they would just be guaranteed to leak, feeling embarrassed to stay over at a partner's house from fear of leaking on the bed. And separate issues about, you know, embarrassment and guilt and shame that we feel there. But yeah, I just love that they've brought it back to the experience rather than, you know, imagine if you had that experience, but you only had 70 mil of blood loss, right? And you wouldn't meet the criteria. It just feels ridiculous. So not only when your period arrives, not only is that important to track, but the qualities of your period. So this is where we really start to get holistic, and you can really get curious about the nitty-gritty and the details of your period. And I know some of you are probably going to love this. You're like, yes, I want to know everything there is to know about my period. And for some people, it might feel a bit more trickier to get into. It might feel, there might be some resistance of like, why do I want to inspect my menstrual blood this much? You know, why do I want to get into this level of detail? And I guess the short answer is because that detail is important. It's communicating a lot with you. Imagine your period as a communication from your body, this special dose of information that's just for you and can help guide decisions for that cycle based around what you eat, what you drink, how you move your body, supplements that you need to take, you know, investigations that you need to have, period. Super simple, might sound obvious, very important, lots of nuance. The second thing that I invite you to track for a holistic tracking experience is tracking your cervical mucus or your cervical fluid. Now, if that is a new phrase to you, you are not alone. This might sound more familiar if I said vaginal discharge or just discharge, because I think that's how a lot of us were raised to connect with our bodily fluid, our secretions. Oh, who hates that word? Secretions. I need to do an ASMR episode where I just say that over and over again. Or not. Let me know. Let me know if you're in the market for that kind of podcast. Gets 100 replies. No. So cervical mucus. Let's break that down. It is fluid that is produced by your cervical cells. So your cervix is the part that sits between your vagina, your vaginal canal, and your uterus. It's like the passageway, the in-between passageway. It's where menstrual blood comes out of. So menstrual blood comes from your uterus down through your cervix, down through your vagina, and then out into the open. It's babies go through it when they are born. Sperm has to go through the cervix if it wants to fertilize an egg that will be waiting up in the fallopian tubes for it. So cervix, underrated part of our beautiful anatomy, so important. So within your cervix, you've got these cells and they produce mucus. That mucus is directly correlated to your estrogen levels and also directly reflects your fertile potential. Why is that? Because the cervical mucus can determine whether sperm do or don't get through your cervix and determines whether they can or can't fertilize an egg that might be waiting for them on the other side. So usually there'll be one of two things. When your period ends, you will experience a feeling of slight moisture, but nothing much really, in your underwear. We also call this, another way of sort of tuning into it is just by your vulva sensation, which again, it may sound simple and like overly simple, but it's quite nuanced. So your vulva sensation is essentially just what you feel at your vulva, so like the opening of your vagina, at your labial lips as you're walking around, as you're going about your day. What do you feel there? You can also tune into this sensation after or before you use the toilet by just wiping some toilet paper across your labia. And you might notice that it's dry. You might notice that it's slightly moist, but nothing much really. And you can also notice that it's quite wet or damp or slippery. And that's where we get into the realm of what is fertile mucus and what isn't. So, yeah, period finishes, one of two things will happen. You will totally dry up for a few days, and then cervical mucus will start to develop into a more wet, creamy, lotiony, building up to a very slippery, maybe even egg white-like or just watery consistency. Or for some people, their period will end and they will go straight into a little bit of moisture. And then from there, it will develop into that more fertile quality mucus instead of having that dry period after their period. It gets confusing when I decide to use that version of the word period when I'm talking about periods. So, in my cycle tracking guide that you can download using the link below, I outline what words and what categories can be helpful to start getting familiar and start practice categorizing your cervical fluid. There are separate categories for sensation, so like what you feel, versus categories for what you observe. And how to observe your mucus, again, just using that toilet paper method. Anytime you get changed, anytime you use the bathroom, I encourage both before and after, because it can be different. After, for example, you push out a bowel movement, that can bring some cervical fluid to the opening to be seen. Just getting a square or 2 squares of toilet paper, folding it over so it's got some thickness to it, and just wiping from front to back once, and then looking at what's on that toilet paper. And you might notice that there's a shine to it, that it's like glistening. You might notice that it's like quite thick and opaque. You might notice that it's clear. There's all these different qualities. And again, these qualities are going to tell you about your estrogen levels. Like this sign alone, if we can have a clearer idea of what your estrogen is doing, that tells us so much about your health and how we may or may not need to support your body to help detoxify estrogen better or to produce more estrogen. It is so, so helpful. So to clarify, those more wet forms of the cervical fluid are the ones that sperm can travel through. So they are the ones that are more fertile when we've got that wet, slippery kind of vibe. And when I say this to people straight off the bat, they're like, no, I don't think I get that. But as soon as I lay it out and like get them familiar with the words that we use for the categories and what it might or might not look like, and all the different types of cervical mucus that there are, then they're like, oh, yeah, I have cervical mucus. Like, how did I not notice this before? And that's certainly what happened to me when I first learned about it. I was 18. I'm like, I don't think I get that. Like, yeah, there's like a bit of something in my underwear. Like, you know, at that point in time, I was just like, yeah, I get discharge in my underwear. And sometimes there's nothing and sometimes there's something. And then I learned about these categories like the egg white mucus and the slippery mucus. I'm like, I don't get that. And then, 2 weeks after learning it, I'm like, oh my God, it's there. And personally, because nothing is TMI here, personally, I notice it more after a bowel movement. And you will notice that fluid the closer you get to ovulation. That's usually what happens. The closer your body gets to releasing that egg and being potentially fertile, it's producing more of that mucus to help sperm get through. Those other kinds of mucus where it's like dry or sticky or tacky or only a little bit moist or like opaque and thick, those kinds of mucus the sperm can't travel through. So they're considered infertile types of mucus. And another quick shout out here. We deep dive into this in my Welcome to the FAM training. FAM stands for Fertility Awareness Method, shout out. And that's where we go through really rigid evidence-based guidelines for using your cervical mucus as one sign for informing natural contraception. Yes, natural contraception exists. As a quick side note, the fertility awareness method. If you're not familiar with it, head to my website. You can read more about it there, or even just search fertility awareness method. And well, maybe no, actually no, don't search it on Google, because Google will probably give you some conflicting advice. Also, if you mention it to your doctor, they might say, oh yeah, great. Or they might say, that's quackery and not real. It is evidence-based, backed by science. It is real. It is an effective form of contraception. It's just the one that takes a bit more effort, and it's the one that just gets spoken about the least. But it exists, and I'm just letting you know that it exists because that feels like my duty as Karinda of Oh My Menses. So download the cycle tracking guide, get familiar with the categories of cervical mucus. There's also some links to some cervical mucus galleries in there that you can find online. And again, I invite you to be open-minded about this. It might feel crass or in your face or gross at first, but I fully believe it is not gross. Our bodies are doing this beautiful thing, beautifully orchestrated by our hormones to either help encourage fertility and encourage conception and bringing life into this world, or to discourage it from happening. And looking at real photos of the mucus can just be so helpful to get you more comfortable with your own and help you start to track that mucus accurately. So just to clarify, what the information that I'm sharing here is not to be considered as official natural contraception advice when I'm talking about fertile mucus and infertile mucus. This is just a rough guideline. It is not tailored to you, so please seek more information or guidance if you are feeling called to. And the reason why I invite all people who have a menstrual cycle to track their cervical mucus is because it gives you an insight into when ovulation is happening. And ovulation is the key to being able to get a real sense of when your period is going to arrive. It also helps divide your menstrual cycle. So we've got the pre-ovulatory phase, the first half of your cycle, and we've got the post-ovulatory phase if we're breaking it into two simple halves. And also when you can look at your mucus and say, yep, that was when it was most fertile. I probably ovulated around there, and then it dropped back off to like dry or nothing much really, or just sticky, barely anything. That's when my fertile window ended. And when we have an idea of when we ovulated, that's when we can harness the power of actual period prediction and not relying on an app to tell us, because an app doesn't know when we ovulated unless we tell it when we ovulated. So from how you would do this is from the last day you noticed any kind of fertile mucus. After that day, you would start another count of 1. So this could be on cycle day 16. You would start a separate, what we would call a peak day count of 1. And from each day, from that day, you count consecutively 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And you know that by day 12 of that count to day 16, that is the window that your period is going to arrive in. Because your period happens 12 to 16 days after ovulation. Now, an interesting caveat, because I'm Karinda, and if you don't know, I'm also one half of the nuanced naturopaths, and there is nuance in everything, and I feel compelled to acknowledge that nuance, even though I want to simplify things. Unfortunately, our bodies are not that simple. So a caveat to that is that you can produce fertile quality mucus without ovulating, because the mucus reflects your estrogen levels. High estrogen levels are needed to ovulate, but they're not the hormonal trigger that makes ovulation happen. So another layer that you can introduce here, and this is something that I absolutely teach with my fertility awareness clients, is basal body temperature. If you track your basal body temperatures, which is essentially just a fancy way of saying your waking temperatures, the temperature from when you first wake up, although that's just when we can best measure it. It's actually your temperature when you're in like deep sleep, like 3 hours into sleep. But it's easiest to measure with an oral thermometer when you first wake up before doing anything else. And when you start to track these temperatures, you will notice, if ovulation happens, you will notice a marked increase in your temperature, one that is easy to see on a chart, on a graph, and that it will be before that temperature rise when you ovulated. And that temperature rise count, so the first day of your temperature rise, marking that as day one is more accurate than going by your cervical mucus to predict when your period is coming. So you notice a temperature rise. After a few days, you realize that it stays high. So you go back to that first day of the rise, mark that as 1, count the days following it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, etc., etc. And when you get to day 12 and day 16, you know that that's the window that your period is going to arrive on unless pregnancy has occurred, and that's a whole other situation. So if you're not familiar with basal body temperature tracking, temperature being a sign of knowing when you ovulated, highly recommend going down that rabbit hole. It is the rabbit hole that has allowed me to be free from hormonal birth control for nearly 10 years now. Very grateful for the fertility awareness method. Again, separate rabbit hole, so I'll try to not say any more on that now, even though it really excites me. And actually, I do have a little guide, just a quick little guide for tracking your basal body temperature for the first time. I will pop the link to that in the show notes. Feel free to download that, use it, tell me how you go with it. And after that temp rise happens, or your cervical mucus reaches a peak and then drops off, you can say, okay, ovulation has occurred and I'm in my luteal phase. I'm in my premenstrual phase. And that's where you can start to introduce additional support for that time if you do get symptoms. That leads me to my next and final point of what to track for primo menstrual cycle tracking beyond the basic level. Tracking your premenstrual symptoms. And the reason why I specify premenstrual, as opposed to any other phase of your cycle, is because this is where we've got some more hormones at play. And this is where symptoms are more likely to appear. Symptoms that people perceive as problematic. Symptoms that get on our nerves. Symptoms that make us feel like there is something wrong with us. Symptoms that can make us feel like we're broken. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with you. I'm not saying that you're broken. But this is just, unfortunately, the time in the menstrual cycle that gets a really bad rap. It's the time in the menstrual cycle where that can cause a lot of people distress. It can be the time in the menstrual cycle that is the difference between someone starting antidepressant medication or not. It's the difference of taking a certain route of medicine versus not. It can really be the make or break of the cycle, I think is a good way of wording it. So it's really important to track. And I'm sure there's a lot of you listening who know that your premenstrual experience is a bit of a rough one. It's not smooth, and you get symptoms and there's discomfort, but you might not be tracking those symptoms. And tracking those symptoms is super helpful because dependent on when they happen in that second half of the cycle can help tell us which hormones or lack of hormones could be contributing to those symptoms. And it also sets this nice baseline of objectivity. So especially if you track your symptoms on a scale of 0 to 10, for example, and you track these symptoms over time, over multiple cycles, Leica is distracting me and coming up for a kiss. It is very cute. But it is podcast recording time, Baba. On your bed. Just a fun little behind the scenes that I'm going to leave in there. And now I'm going to pause because I forget how I finished my last sentence that I was interrupted on. Okay, so when you track these symptoms over time, over multiple cycles, you get to see a changing pattern. You get to try new things, try new treatments. Maybe you're seeing a naturopath or a herbalist or a Chinese medicine doctor, getting acupuncture done, starting a new medication, and you get to see how it's impacting your hormones. Is it the right therapy for you? Is it working? Is it reducing your symptoms that you're tracking? And without that data, it can be, our minds, as brilliant as they are, can play tricks on us. And there's all sorts of biases and external factors that can really warp our perception of what works for our body, when we feel better, when we feel worse, So it's just good to, in the moment, track your symptoms on a scale of 1 to 10. Or in any kind of way that works for you, levels of intensity, writing custom words in, make it work for you. But I think tracking them is important nonetheless. So, to wrap up, how do I recommend tracking your cycle? There are a lot of apps out there. There are a lot of ways you can track your cycle. One way isn't going to be great for everyone. So again, unfortunately, I don't have a simple, straightforward answer. However, if you do want to use an app, I recommend using Read Your Body, as it's entirely customizable. That said, Read Your Body is much more suited to people who are looking to chart their cycle. So really chart those body symptoms those body signs that we spoke about: temperature, cervical fluid, as well as the period. For practicing a fertility awareness method. The reason why I recommend the app anyway, even if you're not using a fertility awareness method, is because it's just so customizable. You can add an endless amount of symptoms in there, track them alongside your cycle in a multitude of ways, and you always have the option there for tracking your temperature and tracking your cervical fluid should you choose to do so. It's relatively user-friendly. It can be a little bit tricky to get your head around it at first. And it's also very affordable. So highly recommend that one. They're also very dedicated to privacy, and it was a crowdfunded project, made by women for women. It's just good. Read Your Body, shout out. My second recommendation, it's a little bit more user-friendly from the get-go, is Kindara. Again, this is more targeted at fertility awareness usage, but it's just a lot more simple than Read Your Body. So there's less room for customization unless you pay a higher price. You can use Kindara for free on a very basic level, which I still do recommend to a lot of people, especially if you're not wanting to use it as natural contraception. Absolutely go for it. You can track your period, you can track your mucus, your vaginal sensation, and your temperatures. And it gives you a nice graph as you move through your cycle. And looking at menstrual cycle charts is just one of my favorite things to do, especially when there's temperatures there. But even when there's not, I just love it. As for apps that don't really incorporate any charting element, I haven't used many in years, but I know a lot of people use Flow, F-L-O. And again, I just recommend with any app that you use, turn off predictions if you can, at the very least, just so you can stop relying on the app to tell you when your period is coming, and get more connected to your own body, what you're experiencing with the shifts of the phases as you move from ovulation to luteal, as you start to feel the drop, closer to your period arriving. You can practice counting the days based on mucus or based on your temperature of how long your luteal phase is going for. Get in the swing of predicting when your period's going to come. Remembering that, and I will repeat this, and I will get sick of myself saying this, remembering that your period will arrive 12 to 16 days after ovulation. And that's why it's so important to track ovulation. So turn off predictions. It's not, to me, it's not congruent with what I teach and preach and live. It's not congruent with being connected to our bodies in a really grounded and embodied way. And our bodies aren't too complicated to interpret. And I feel like needing app predictions helps promote that message of, oh, our bodies are too complicated, like let's just let an app do it. Because an app is always going to be infinitely better at telling me when my period's going to arrive than I could possibly be for myself. So apps are great in a lot of different ways. Turn off predictions if you can. Another app recommendation that doesn't really involve cycle charting is Stardust. I like it because it is hippie. It appeals to all my hippie values. It is colorful. It relates your cycle to the moon. But you know, with these apps that aren't charting apps, the common downfall that they have is that they don't usually allow for custom data input where you can tell the app, here's when I ovulated because I took my temperatures, because I'm checking my cervical fluid, here's when I ovulated. And instead they just say, your menstrual cycles for the last 6 cycles that you've entered have gone from 27 to 32 days. Based on that, algorithmically, we're going to say when you ovulate each cycle. But you can't predict ovulation. Ovulation happens when it happens. And yes, there is a general rhythm to it, but we can't predict any upcoming ovulation. There are so many factors that can make our ovulation happen earlier or later, and therefore delay our period. So yeah, just another reason why I don't trust an app to tell us when we ovulate. So if you can guarantee me that you will happily ignore any estimations that a pretty app makes on when you ovulated, then go ahead, use the app. And I will be doing a series of reels of just app reviews, I think, because I think it's needed. A lot of people ask me what app to use. So I'll do some reviews on Instagram on what apps I recommend and why. So Kindara and Read Your Body, #not-sponsored, are my most highly recommended apps. I also have on Google Sheets, as part of the cycle tracking guide, I have a cycle tracking template. And I have a version that includes temperatures. I have a version that doesn't include temperatures. But essentially, I have laid out the categories for you. I have set up the template for you. You just need to put in the dates, the days of the week, mark when your period arrives, mark when you notice certain kinds of cervical fluid. I've got columns and rows there for symptoms, and you can, obviously it's Google Sheets, so you can customize that. You can add rows, delete rows that aren't relevant to you, add symptoms to track. And I've added some guidance there on how you can best use it. So if you are a digital person, I highly recommend you check that out as part of the cycle tracking guide, links below. And if you're old school, you can track in a diary, in a journal, on a calendar. You can stick to, I guess, the classic method that we're all taught, mark your period on a calendar. Bonus points if that calendar also includes the moon phases. Woo! Then we can get really groovy. More on that in later episodes. But yeah, just making sure that we're going beyond tracking the period if you are doing it on paper, that you are making notes on the cervical fluid that you notice, that you are making notes on your symptoms, and that you are making notes on those qualities of your bleed, not just marking when the period happens. And also, a big thing here. Bonus tip at the end. Counting, and an app will do this for you, but counting your cycle days. If you're tracking on paper, in a diary, journal, paper calendar, tracking your cycle days. So this isn't just tracking the day of the week or the date on the calendar month, which a lot of people go by, like, oh yeah, my period always comes on the 7th or the 8th. And I'm like, but there's variations in the calendar month. That could mean your cycle is varying, and that could tell you a lot about your health. So don't stress about the calendar date. Focus more on your cycle day. So counting from that cycle day 1, the first day of full flow bleeding onwards. Noting that, not everyone is going to have a textbook 28-day cycle. I think that's also important to shout out. But if your cycles are varying a lot, going from 25 to 29 to 36 to 24 days, that could be a sign that your body needs some support and that there's something to focus your attention towards, which is really important. Generally, cycles that are longer than 35 days consistently suggest that there might be an imbalance there. Just if you want any sort of reference to know what's normal and what's not, that's what I'd say there. Consistently over 35 days could, not necessarily definitely, but could be a sign of an imbalance. Do I have anything else that I want to say about cycle tracking? Yeah, count your cycle days. It's good to know how long your cycle goes for. And I guess to further clarify, a cycle is the time from when one period starts up until the day before your next period starts. So we're counting from one period to the next, essentially. And we can have even more confidence in that when we know that we ovulated 2 weeks before that period arrives, rather than not knowing whether we ovulated or not, and then bleeding happening. Because again, bleeding that doesn't happen, that occurs outside of 2 weeks after ovulation, bleeding that happens where ovulation didn't occur beforehand, could be a sign of something else that is asking for your attention, and that could warrant a visit to the doctor. So ovulation, really important. 2 shout outs here. All About Ovulation Masterclass. It is, I think, an hour and 15 minutes live masterclass that I hosted, going in the ins and outs of ovulation and this very important time in your menstrual cycle. It's $22, instant replay. You get the slides as well, and an audio version too if you'd prefer to listen to it on the go. You don't have to sit down and watch it. This is just information that I think every woman, every person with a menstrual cycle needs to know. This is the chicken that comes before the egg, although, chicken or the egg. The egg that comes before the chicken, I don't know. But ovulation needs to happen first before you have the whole menstrual cycle. It starts the ripple effect. It is the initiator of life. It is where your hormones reach a peak. There's so much magic to ovulation. Please go and check out All About Ovulation Masterclass. Links below. The second thing I want to prompt you to get your hands on is that holistic cycle tracking guide, where I outline everything that we've discussed today. And you've also got access in that to my cycle tracking template on Google Sheets and a little video guide of me walking you through using that template. And you've also got examples of my real life charts on Kindara and Read Your Body, as well as some examples of tracking your cycle using just the notes in your phone and some other ways that you can do that. Yeah, that's it, fam. Hit me up on Instagram at Karinda Holistics, KARINDA.WHOLISTIX. And send me a DM. Let me know what you thought of this episode. Let me know if you have any questions from it. I would love for everyone to be tracking their menstrual cycle in this way that offers more depth, that offers more insight into our bodies. And I would just love to hear from you if you're starting it, if you're excited to try it, how it's been going for you. Please do let me know. I will see you in the next one. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Oh My Menses. If you have a special request of something you'd like to hear me talk about, or you have any questions that you want to ask me, please drop me a line at hello@karindaholistics.com.au. I would like to acknowledge the land and country on which I live, work and create, that of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I honour their connection to land, sea, flora and fauna across this country. I pay my respects to the elders of these communities, past, present and forthcoming.